On this vote, the yeas are 80, the nays are 12. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. President?
You need a mic.
I've got a
The
mic.
Senate will be in order. Senators, please take your conversations outside. The Senate will come to order. The senator from Rhode Island. The senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you. Thank you. We are going to go to final passage, and I just want to make one comment that this is really a significant vote, not just because it's the NDAA and many of us
Will come to order, please.
A lot of people contend, as I do, that every year the NDAA is the most significant vote that we have. This year, especially so, in light of all the disruptions and problems that we've had. And once again, I want to say how great it's been to work and show the American people that Democrats and Republicans can work together and get significant legislation passed. I'm very proud that we have this bill. And I'm proud to have worked with Senator Reid and his staff.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, this legislation is essential to the national security of the United States and to the welfare of the troops and the families who defend us every day. I would urge all of my colleagues to vote to override the veto. I want to thank Senator Inhofe for his extraordinary leadership, commend our staff, John Bonsall on the Republican side, Liz King on the Democratic side, and all the staffers. And again, I urge a vote to override. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I know no further debate.
Is there any further debate? If not, the question is, shall the bill pass, the objections of the President of the United States to the contrary notwithstanding? The yeas and nays are required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Scott. Day. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. You can change it home. Mr. Braun. I did, thank you. I did. Lay, you're an aye? Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. I got you. Thank you. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy.
You got me, ma'am, right?
I do, thank you.
Happy New Year.
You too. Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Durbin. I did, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner. Thank you. Mrs. Gillibrand. I did. Mr. Graham. Murray.
You are large and in charge.
You too. Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono. Thank you. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly. I got him. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass. I got him. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, thank you, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Enzi, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Gillibrand, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kelly, Klobuchar, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, McConnell, Menendez, Moran, Murkowski, Murray, Peters, Reed, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Van Hollen, Warner, and Whitehouse. Mr. Risch, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Kennedy, Lee, Merkley, and Paul. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Yeah. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Booker, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Yeah. Mr. Udall, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cruz, no.